China during the 20th century was a nation being reformed, influenced, and remade, finding its identity. Seaports brought in new technologies, aesthetics, and practices. Ideas on what a woman should wear, how a story is written, what a movie should display, or what an image could depict.
The people of China did not resist these ideas, but they acknowledged its existence. Hi, I'm Jocelyn.
And hi, I'm Brooke.
And today we'll be sharing how they processed the ideas, criticized them, and how we see the manifestation in China's fashion, cinema, literature, and art. So first, fashion. For centuries, Chinese fashion for women was modest. A woman's attire should have reflected her role to stay within the inner quarters, to stay at home, care for her family, and raise their children. Traditional robes had loose sleeves, high necklines, and skirts, hiding curves of the body. Foot binding was especially popular between the Song and Qing dynasty, crushing women's feet to make them small and fit the beauty standard. This practice marked high status because it meant the girl never had to work, implying the value of domesticity for women. However, as foreign power began to dominate the economic market, fashion began to shift as well. According to The Secret of Her Greatness, in the 1890s, a group of Western women gifted the Bible to Empress Dowager Cixi in hopes of spreading the religion, showing the Western ideas that women could be of influence and start reform. Empress Cixi accepted the gift and returned traditional women items such as handkerchiefs and other daily materials, showing how women should stay in their traditional roles. The fact that the Empress rejected the progressive ideas may have reflected how the Chinese valued traditional gender roles at the time and kept women conserved. The cultural value of domesticity through the 1930s is also captured through the character of Olan in Pearl S. Buck's The Good Earth from 1931. The virtuous Chinese woman was defined by her labor at home. She spent hours sewing padded winter coats for her family, and her work not only helped her family, but it was her identity. Her clothing was also described to be the modest flat-cut robes which enforced the idea her body belonged to the labor at home and not for the public eye. As Western power came into China in the later 1930s, we can see the social status of women begin to change. They entered the workforce, pursued education, and gained legal rights alongside the anti-colonial movements. There are also new laws on divorce property, such as the 1930s Civil Code, which allowed women to have equal say in their marital status and have the freedom to file a divorce. We can see these reforms manifest in their fashion as well. From the traditional loose, fitted clothing for women, designers began to adopt Western cutting and stitching techniques, no longer cut in the flat two-dimensional shapes. Curved cutting was introduced, and darts were used at the chest and wrist. The new techniques allowed them to show curves of the body. These robes were high-waisted, figure-hugging with slits up to the thighs, initially for mobility but later for style. Shoe binding for status also transitioned to high heels, from shrinking oneself to elevating and showing confidence. A perfect example of a modern woman would be Su Meiling, also known as the First Lady of the Republic of China and Chiang Kai-shek's wife. Not only was she educated, she received her degree abroad at Wesley College in the United States. During her speech to the Women's Advisory Council, she pushed the idea that women should not only be good wives and mothers, but also good citizens, showing how they should contribute to the public outside of homemaking. As a politician who had Western influences, she wore cheap hose that had Western tailoring. For example, shoulder pads and a cinched waist. Ultimately, the shift in what women wore was not just fashion, but it displays the cultural influence the West had on China during the time of revolution. From wearing loose, modest clothing to tighter dresses, we can see the transition from staying at home to being a good citizen.
And now let's take a look at cinema. During the 1930s, not only did fashion evolve, but Shanghai also became a central hub of cinematic production and cultural exchange. At a time when global film industries were rapidly expanding, Shanghai developed a distinct cinematic identity shaped by both foreign influence and domestic resistance. In America, Hollywood established itself as a dominant force in global cinema and created significant impact on Shanghai cinema. There were a total of 412 foreign films shown in China in 1934, of which 364 were American. Chinese theaters would often compete for contracts with Hollywood studios to ensure supplies of new films. For example, contracts were made with both MGM and Paramount, as well as 20th Century Fox, Warner Bros., and First National. Additionally, Chinese media was flooded with fan magazines about Hollywood actors with photos or gossip due to the U.S. business contracts with Chinese exhibitors. Their popularity led to a shift in Chinese culture that looked to copy the imagery seen on screen. New gender relations and perceptions of the body were configured through the creation and reception of modern imagery in these vernacular films. Gone were the days of the 1920s, amorous maidens in classic costume, and in were a new breed of modern urban lifestyles. As Shanghai grew as a central hub for China's theater, opposition to Hollywood encroachment created a film culture torn between brands and modernism. Thus, a new culture movement began, the New Film Culture Movement. In the midst of a Japanese invasion and economic pressures from global markets, left-wing filmmakers drew on curating films to push public narratives and reflect local concerns relating to nationalism, social inequality, and cultural identity. This is demonstrated through Chang Bao's film Spring Silkworms that takes the viewer inside Old Tung Pao's family village to portray foreign intervention and the widespread hardships and instability in rural communities. Spring Silkworms is said to be the first sound of adapting the new culture to screen through directly transferring the literary works of Mao Dun onto a screen. Therefore, Hollywood, Western influence, in terms of resistance to it, helped to create a new genre in Chinese cinema that was centered on idioms of critical realism and nationalistic beliefs. China wanted an independent cinematic industry, not one controlled under American domination, and looked to channel the May 4th ideology of the modern vernacular fiction into the domain of entertainment. Instead of idolizing American film modernization, China took the path of transforming their own film culture thanks to left-wing filmmakers in the New Film Culture Movement.
Now moving on to literature. For many years, Chinese literature was written in a formal way, a way that was so different from everyday language, only the elite and wealthy could read and understand it. However, as foreign issues began to rise, literature became a vessel for individuals to share and spread their ideas. Spoken drama and the use of vernacular language allowed for a wider range of the population to understand, leading to political change. Vernacular language was particularly useful in analyzing Western ideals and pushing political agendas. For example, Henrik Ibsen's A Dollhouse introduced a radical idea to the Chinese from Norway, the idea that a woman could simply walk out of the home if they were feeling displeased with their husband and their environment. The feeling of freedom an individual could accomplish seems so easy and so simple. However, Chinese author Lu Xun criticized this idea, explaining how if Nora wasn't happy in her environment and actually left the household, she would only have two options: to starve or go back home. This specific critique pushed the idea that the system was set up in a way where individuals could not actually achieve individual freedom, contributing to a popular ideology in China during the time. Another prominent author during this period was Mao Dun, who wrote Spring Silkworms. Main character Old Tung Pao, whose family was once successful, was now in debt, hungry, and in a financial crisis. Mao Dun emphasized how it was nearly impossible for an individual to find individual freedom. All were forced to do what they could to survive, being controlled by the circumstances they were in. Their family was under the control of debt, economy, low demand for silk, foreign trade, and more. In another famous novella, The True Story of Akyu was a poor, irrelevant man of society. Lu Xun illustrated his miserable life, showing how he was a puppet of the feudal system, the local elites, and his status. Author Ba Jin also writes a perfect example of the lack of individual freedom. Jin tells the story of Gao Xin, a young man. Xin has ideas and dreams for his future, but is forced by his grandfather to give up managing his family's estate and marrying a woman he doesn't love. Ba Jin doesn't only illustrate the economic struggles of the people, but also acknowledges how young men are also controlled by expectations from family and duties. Again, no one is really free. These three texts help peasants realize how their suffering was not a result of their laziness or incompetence, but it was a consequence of the system. The rise in vernacular language allowed for more people to understand the current issues and ideas that were being passed around, not just elites. Peasants were also able to develop political opinions that fueled revolutions, such as the Communist Revolution, which relied heavily on using the rural population against the feudal constraints Lu Xun and Mao Dun described.
And last but not least, the arts. The Chinese arts also conformed to Western influences. However, similar to cinema, it was a selective process. Chinese artists faced a question that was also a political statement. What should Chinese art do? The answer for many came not from within China's own traditions, but from Europe. Chinese artists began adopting the bold, black and white visual language of European expressionism and the social conscience of social realism. This was a deliberate choice. Western aesthetic frameworks offer Chinese artists a proven vocabulary for depicting inequality, resistance, and collective struggle, a common theme we've seen in Chinese literature and film as well. If one figure embodies the Western influence on Chinese art in this period, it is Kathy Kollwitz. According to Wei Minxing's class lecture, Kollwitz was a German artist born in 1867 who spent her career making the invisible visible. Her woodcuts depicted grieving mothers, exhausted workers, and the human wreckage of war. They were moral documents as much as artistic ones, and when Chinese intellectuals counted her work, they recognized something essential. Here was a Western artist whose concerns, poverty, injustice, and dignity of the marginalized, were also China's concerns. This was not passive admiration. It was strategic adoption. The key figure in this transfer of influence was Lu Xun. As a poet, essayist, and cultural critic, Lu Xun understood that Chinese artistic transformation required foreign models. Lu Xun's Champion of Colowitz is a case study in how foreign ideas entered China in this era and filtered Western art through a Chinese political and social lens. He wasn't simply importing a style, he was arguing that Chinese art needed to confront Chinese suffering with the same unflinching honesty he saw in Colowitz's work. The result was a cultural trend that spread rapidly through artistic communities, proof that Western influence, when filtered through local urgency, could ignite something entirely new. What happened next reveals just how deeply this Western influence movement had taken root. The woodcut became the dominant visual medium of wartime China, and then in 1942 it received official sanction from the highest levels of Chinese political leadership. This is the full arc of Western influence in 1930s China, a foreign art form introduced by foreign artists, championed by Chinese intellectuals, adopted by a mass movement, and ultimately absorbed into the machinery of the Chinese state. The Western seed had grown into something unrecognizably Chinese. Overall, Shanghai's pop culture's shifting nature is ultimately a story about how cultures evolve. China's fashion, cinema, literature, and art in the 1930s did not develop in a vacuum. It looked outward into Germany, into Europe, into the global language, and in doing so found a way to speak more forcibly about its own experience. Foreign ideals did not dilute Chinese culture in this period, but rather they accelerated and paved a way for Chinese writers, filmmakers, artists to shape and include their own Chinese interpretation. In doing so, Shanghai not only responded to global influences, but also asserted its own voice during a period of profound political and cultural transformation.
In conclusion, just like Marx believes, reform always begins with ideas, and ideas come from influences and inspiration. In the 1930s, Chinese cultural development was strongly inspired by foreign culture and the political state of the economy.
Women had a greater purpose than homemaking, film expanded through modernization, literature was used to push political agendas, and art was a catalyst for expression.